Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Nedbank Energy Dialogue 2021, Electric Mobility, Unlocking Synergies on the Road to Cleaner and Better Vehicles. My name is Thabang Mahlangu. I'm the Sector Lead for Automotive, Transport and Logistics at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Bank. Today, we've got a great lineup of speakers coming from different sectors or different segments of the electric vehicle value chain. We have Mr. Michael Mabasa, who is the Chief Executive at NAMSA. We also have Mr. Mkhululi Mlota, who's the Chief Director for Automotives at the DTIC. Welcome, good sir. We have as a keynote address the MEC for Roads and Transport in Gauteng, Mr. Jacob Mamabolo, who will be giving us the keynote address today. We also have Mr. Theo Malele from the Gauteng National Taxi Alliance that will talk about the role of mass transport in the space. And then finally, we'll have Mr. Stefan Potgieter, the Executive for Asset Ownership at Nedbank, a retail bank, who will talk to us the transition away from internal combustion engines to EV. Thank you everyone for joining today. We hope it's going to be a fruitful conversation that will allow us as stakeholders in the sector to really drive conversation and also find solutions for how we can unlock electric vehicles. Without any further ado, I'll start by inviting Mr. Michael Mabasa from NAMSA, a Chief Executive at NAMSA, a gentleman who is big on thought leadership in the space and works quite closely with OEMs and retailers. And he will be giving us his insight on how NAMSA sees electric vehicle adoption and penetration in South Africa. Mr. Mabasa, over to you.
Thabang, thank you very much for the warm welcome, and I want to take this time as well to welcome firstly the MEC, MEC Mamabolo. Good to see you, MEC, and good to be with you on this particular important conversation. Also, a very good morning to my brother and colleague, Mkhululi Mlota from the DTIC, Mr. Potgieter, and certainly those who are joining us online. Good to have you also on board. I'm just going to very briefly reflect on what the automotive industry in South Africa is focusing on in relation to electromobility, as we call it. If you do not mind going to the next slide as I open my talk, I will be taking you through some of the work that the automotive industry is really focusing on in order for us to be able to progress specifically the issues around electromobility in the country, because it has certainly become a very important topical issue for us as a country for a number of reasons. And I'll walk you through some of those reasons because they're absolutely critical in really shaping the future of the automotive industry going forward. But before I go into the electromobility conversation in detail, if you don't mind going to the next slide, just to remind all those who are joining us on the call that NAMSA as an organization is obviously the Automotive Business Council, and we represent quite a number of stakeholders within the automotive industry in South Africa. And NAMSA as an organization is 86 years old, and it was established in 1935. We've got full members in our manufacturing OEMs. We've got retailing OEMs. Those are OEMs that are importing vehicles into the country. And then also we have our heavy commercial vehicle OEMs in the country. And I'm sure that many of you are also aware that we, as a country, are hosting currently 7 manufacturing plants in South Africa. And we've been doing so for quite a number of years. And we're very pleased that many of these manufacturing plants were able to stay the course with us. And they're obviously absolutely committed to continuing their investment in South Africa as much as possible. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the type of brands that we have in the country. that we are representing in South Africa. On your left-hand side is obviously all the brands that are manufacturing currently in South Africa. As I indicated, we've got 7 brands that are manufacturing. In the middle of that slide, you've got retailing OEMs, and these are OEMs that are really importing and distributing their brands in the market in South Africa. And then on the right-hand side is your heavy commercial OEMs, and here we're talking specifically buses and heavy trucks that we have in the country. And we're very pleased, obviously, as NAMSA, that there is no vehicle brand that is in the country today which is not a member of NAMSA. All of them are members of NAMSA, and that really helps us to be able to coordinate a unified voice in relation to the work that we do. On the next slide, you'll see our operating structure is very, very diverse in a sense that it's able to help us to really make sure that our corporate governance is structured in such a way that we are able to work not only amongst ourselves, but certainly amongst many other stakeholders, including government. As you can see, for example, on that particular slide, we have established what we call the oversight, executive oversight committee, which is led by our minister, which is a very influential and very important structure that really helps us to coordinate not only government policy, but certainly also the work that we're doing in terms of our automotive master plan, that looks at our trajectory for 2035. So we've also, at the beginning of this year, invited associate members within the NAMSA ecosystem so that we can really be able to make sure that the representation of NAMSA is not only by the vehicle makers and importers and distributors, but certainly all the different sectors that have interest in the automotive industry, because the industry is obviously evolving. We are able to obviously attract all those particular members to be able to contribute meaningfully to the work of the automotive industry. If you go to the next slide, I'm just going to talk to some very key numbers, and I'm just going to be high level without necessarily deep diving on the specifics, because you'd recall that the automotive industry makes a huge social and economic contribution to the country's economy and has grown to become the leading manufacturing sector in the country's economy. But we all know that since last year, COVID-19 has severely affected the industry quite significantly. Our contribution to the country's GDP is normally around 7%, and it accounts for around 1/3 of the manufacturing output. But obviously, since last year, those figures came down to 4.9% of the GDP contribution and also 18.7% of the manufacturing output of the country. The value of our total exports last year dropped obviously to 176 billion rands, which is around 13.9% of the country's total exports across all the sectors that we have within our economy. And despite this decline in vehicle exports under COVID-19, we've seen that our automotive components exports achieved a new record of about 55 billion rands last year, driven mainly by a record catalytic converters that were exported, particularly to the EU, in line with stricter emission legislation, which were implemented in that region at the beginning of last year. The industry's annual revenue is normally around 500 billion rands, and employment in the automotive supply chain, consisting of vehicle and component manufacturing and retail side of the industry, comprises of around 160,000 people only in the formal automotive sector. And we all know that the industry supports more than 1 million jobs and job opportunities, particularly in view of the linkages with other sectors of our economy. And obviously, despite the challenges that were imposed on us by COVID-19, the industry continues to invest in the economic life of South Africa. This year alone, big capital investment and human capital injection linked to new model introduction, such as the 16 billion rand that was announced by Ford Motor Company earlier this year, the official opening of the brand new C-Class model by Mercedes-Benz in East London, and also the 2.6 billion investment by Toyota last month after their grand opening of the hybrid production line of the Toyota Corolla Cross continues to inspire confidence in our country's economic recovery story and obviously our growth ambitions. Our industry is firmly committed to the country's economic recovery story and growth ambitions in a very, very big way. And we obviously want to continue to invest ahead of the curve in order for us to be able to propel the industry going forward. If you go to the next slide, on this slide, I'm just sharing some of the current numbers in relation to the next, the key four key performance indicators. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but just to punctuate that since last year, we are beginning to see some recovery in relation to the numbers that we have. We are tracking four key performance indicators: domestic sales, exports, domestic production, and obviously imports. And you can clearly see from all those four KPIs that South Africa is slowly coming back. And we are certainly very confident that the industry will be back fully, hopefully towards the second quarter of next year. And when I say come back fully, we are hoping that we'll obviously be able to see the same levels that we've seen in 2019 around the second quarter of 2022. So that is very, very encouraging. When we go to the next slide, and this is where I would like to reflect, on the automotive industry's role, specifically in the electromobility conversation. And I would like you to allow me to reflect on some historical facts so that it can be able to help us to shape the future of the automotive industry as we go into this new future of electromobility. I am convinced, as obviously industry players, that the future of the automotive industry is going to change faster in the next 10 years than it has in the last 100 years. Historical and historians consistently remind us about the first industrial revolution and some of the lessons that we should not forget as we reimagine the future and as we progress as people through human development. History has taught us that technological change rarely advances smoothly. It develops in revolutions. You would recall that telecommunications progressed from telegraphs to telephones, from copper wires to fiber optics, from analog to digital, from cables to wireless, and now today we are experiencing satellite communication. The relevance of looking back at history is to focus on lessons learned. The transition between the two revolutions, which is the first and the second, did not go well, and we know this. Many of the strong and vibrant economies and companies around the world of the first revolution era disappeared in the second revolution. We are on the verge of another revolution, and the question that we should all ask ourselves is, will we make the same mistakes that we've seen when there was a transition between the first revolution into the second? A mindset shift, something that did not happen in the previous transition, must obviously occur now in order to be able to make this transition smoother. And I think it is very clear from the first revolution that more than 600 million, as you've seen on the previous slide, people around the world still do not benefit from mechanization that we have currently around the world. When you look at this slide around the second industrial revolution of the early 1900th century, commonly known as the special century, there were breakthroughs in chemistry. The world got new materials and paved the way for nitrogen fertilizers, and the green revolution of the 50s and subsequent spike in human population took effect. From sanitation to international air travel to second industrial revolution ushered the modern world as we know it today. If you look at photography, for an example, It changed from glass plates to film, to digital, from black and white pictures that we used to have to color pictures. Today, as we are meeting today, some of the world's breathtaking photographs are brought to life through a click of our smartphones. This pattern also holds true in virtually every field and in every sector of each and every sector of our economy, particularly where a door to new innovation that can be able to revolutionize industries and sometimes our societies. Despite all these developments that we're seeing around us because of innovation and technology, 3.6 billion people around the world still do not have clean water, sanitation, and electricity. And we know this to be true also in our own country. If you go to the next slide, and particularly the next revolution, which is currently where we are and obviously progressing into the fourth revolution, when you compare the first revolution and the second one, it is estimated that the third revolution, which is currently where we are now, is happening 10 times faster than the second revolution. We are living in the information age. And today, as we are connecting on this particular Nedbank Energy webinar, many of us have connected from our homes, from our offices, from coffee shops, and even from our vehicles, because computerization, automation, internet, and cell phones have brought our world much closer than ever before. Although we know that these disruptions are happening, most of us fail to comprehend the full magnitude of these particular changes. And despite this development, 3.9 billion people still do not have access to internet today. And we also know that South Africa is also lagging behind in this particular space. When we go to the next slide, you'll see that the speed of the current breakthroughs has no historical precedence. Globalization is going to unite the world horizontally by erasing national borders, but it will also simultaneously divide humanity vertically. Humans as individuals and humankind will increasingly deal with things nobody ever encountered before, such as super intelligent machines, engineered bodies, algorithms that can manipulate our emotions with uncanny precision. Today, we are at the start of such a revolution also in the automotive industry. It is part of a larger fourth industrial revolution conversation that has become a buzzword for all our conversations about innovation and progress. Within the automotive industry, this revolution is going to be driven by how we redefine mobility, the convergence of connectivity, electrification, and changing customer needs. It is also going to allow policymakers, lawmakers, and also automakers alike to develop dramatically cleaner, safer, smarter, and more efficient, energy-efficient vehicles for consumers, not only for our local consumption needs, but certainly for the world over. On the next slide, it is our view that we are steadily moving away from an industry that for 100 years has relied on vehicles that are standalone, mechanically controlled, and petroleum fueled, to vehicles that will be interconnected, electronically controlled, and fueled by different energy sources and drivetrains. And as I said earlier on when I started my talk, is that I want to reaffirm that the automotive industry is going to change faster in the next 10 years than it has in the last 100 years. This rapid change gives us the opportunity to make cars more capable, more sustainable, and more exciting than ever before. It is by no coincidence that Nedbank and all other commercial banks in the country today are now active members of NAMSA, the automotive industry. Nedbank has a special place to play in this evolution and the capacity to lead our market in the provision of bespoke vehicle finance products that will change the manner in which consumers view finance of vehicles in the future. Because we know that people are no longer going to be asking for vehicle finance just to finance a car, but they'll be coming to also finance, for an example, electricity needs in their homes in order for them to be able to power that particular vehicle. And for us, that is obviously the great reset that we need to be able to look at in order for us to be able to move into the new evolution of electromobility. On the next slide, you'll see that the electrification of vehicle is being enabled in part by breakthrough in battery technology that is helping us to develop cars which will achieve better and much improved city and highway driving economy. Electrification is also at the root of many advances in vehicle safety. By integrating cameras, radars, and sophisticated sensors, cars on South African roads will offer an array of intelligent technologies like blind spot detection, collision warning systems, adaptive cruise control, and crash imminent braking systems, which can only stop a car automatically when the driver cannot be able to do so. We are equally excited about the pioneering telecommunication network, including the extensive rollout of 5G network wireless connectivity in South Africa today. These IT platforms will allow cars to act as Wi-Fi hotspots and connect more devices, while at the same time they are able to literally, on their own, become rolling mobile devices. Connectivity will get more exciting when vehicles are connected with other vehicles on our roads and even with the highways that we are traveling on. Vehicle-to-vehicle communication will allow cars to communicate with one another over a dedicated Wi-Fi band and will share information about vehicle speed, direction of travel, traffic flow, and also road and weather conditions. The next step in connectivity is obviously going to be something that I know is very passionate to the MEC, which is really going to be vehicle to infrastructure communication. Many of us today, we frown when we are asked to pay e-tolls currently deployed across the Gauteng highways or the highway network. This exciting infrastructure is cutting edge innovation that is going to assist in managing urban traffic congestion, which already costs our fiscal billions of rands in wasted fuel and productivity. And the problem is obviously growing rapidly, notwithstanding the introduction of the Gautrain rapid rail between Johannesburg and Pretoria. Vehicle-to-infrastructure communication is going to help when vehicles are connected to smart highways and also traffic lights when they're linked to highly accurate real-time traffic updates and also navigation system. We can significantly reduce congestion and urban commute times in addition to further improving vehicle safety. For us as NAMSA, the existing e-toll gantry infrastructure is going to be a game changer for our electromobility ambitions. Whether our government makes a decision to scrap the payment of e-tolls as a fee for people to be able to go up and down, and we are not advocating for any position, our view is that that infrastructure should be jealously preserved in order for us to be able to make sure that that cutting technology that it brings with it is able to be kept, and we're able to advance our electromobility ambitions as a country going forward. On the next slide, you'll see that according to the South African national greenhouse gas emissions, transport has been identified as the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emission, accounting for about 10.8% of national greenhouse gas emissions in South Africa. Aviation accounts for about 5%, maritime 2.2%, rail 1.6%, and direct emissions from road sector accounts for about 91.2%, mainly from combustion of petrol and diesel. Obviously, we are working very hard together with the Department of Transport to be able to achieve South African vision, which will substantially reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts from transportation by 5% in 2050. NAMSA and obviously the entire automotive industry supports this particular vision, and we will obviously work very, very hard to be able to make a contribution to this particular achievement of this particular goal. If you go to the next slide, you'll also see that we are very clear that EVs are something, or is something that South Africa has to consider very, very firmly, not only because of the challenges that we have in relation to our environmental needs. We know that currently South Africa is producing vehicles, and as I indicated at the beginning of my presentation, we've got 7 OEMs that are producing vehicles in South Africa today. 64% of what these manufacturers are producing in South Africa, 64% is not sold in this country. We are exporting to 147 different markets around the world. 64%. That's a massive, contribution that we are making. And if South Africa does not evolve, particularly from the manufacturing point of view, obviously we are putting at a very huge risk, that capacity to be able to produce for the international market. And we know that many of the countries where we are currently exporting our vehicles into, they have already given us notice that in the next 5 to 7 years, they will no longer be accepting our internal combustion engines because of their own environmental targets that they've set in those particular markets, and they're banning completely internal combustion engines. So South Africa has no option but to obviously adapt with the technology that the world is moving into. We're very obviously excited, and we look forward to hearing more from my colleague Mkhululi Mlota, that government has already put on the table a green paper discussion document, which will obviously evolve into a white paper and hopefully a very clear government policy in relation to how we are going to be managing new energy vehicles as a country going forward. And the industry will obviously remain absolutely committed in making sure that we're able to evolve into that particular space as quickly as possible. If you go to the next slide, and this is my third last slide, you'll see some global trends in relation to what's happening globally in relation to the evolution of new energy vehicles vis-a-vis the internal combustion engines. If we can move to the next slide. And on the top left of that slide, you can clearly see the relationship between the line on. Sorry, if you can reverse back to the previous slide, you'll clearly see that there's a relationship between new energy vehicles and also ICE engines. And according to global estimates, we're estimating that the two are going to cross around 2036, where we are going to see the emergence of electric vehicles overtaking the production of ICE engines in that particular year, which is about 15 years from now, quite frankly. And that's why we believe very strongly that South Africa has to obviously accelerate its capacity to be able to make sure that we're able to also play our part in relation to this important evolution of electric vehicles. You can also clearly see on this particular slide that there are a number of issues that are going to be impacted very directly by our response as a country, whether you're looking at it through the lens of employment, the strategic development of the country and our vision as articulated in our master plan, and then of course, obviously the fiscus and the revenue that the industry is generating, as I indicated, the contribution to the GDP that we bring into the country. So all these things, we obviously have to take them into account in order for us to be able to really calibrate our capacity to can be able to accelerate our path towards electrification. On the slide on the bottom left is some of the governments that have already announced their plans to ban particularly fossil fuel vehicles in their own markets. And many of those countries we're currently exporting into as South Africa. On the next page, you'll see, and I think I've made this point, that 64% of what we are currently producing as a country goes out of the country as exports, and we want to be able to secure those production numbers as much as possible so that we can really be able to make sure that South Africa continues to be able to produce vehicles in our own right as much as possible. We know, for an example, that the EU has really put in very, very stringent targets for their markets, and many of them in the next 5 to 10 years, they would have banned completely internal combustion engines in their markets, and they would have introduced new energy vehicles. And that's why South Africa, it is absolutely critical that we accelerate our intentions to evolve electric markets, new energy vehicle markets as much as and as quickly as possible. My last slide really talks to the work that we are doing in relation to the current status quo in relation to how we need to stimulate demand for electric vehicles in South Africa. Unfortunately, as you can see on this slide really confirms that the uptake of electric vehicles or new energy vehicles, if we may use that broad term, really shows you that since 2016, we've seen a very slow uptake, people showing interest in buying new energy vehicles. If you look at 2020 numbers, your plug-in hybrid vehicles in the country, we sold only 232 units. And when you look at electric vehicle, pure battery electric vehicles, we only sold about 92 units last year. And we believe very strongly that there's an opportunity for us to stimulate demand for these vehicles so that South Africans can be able to adopt these vehicles as quickly as possible. And that's why we're accelerating quite a number of discussions, including issues around charging infrastructure, because a lot of people are obviously concerned about the traveling distances. If you want to travel from Musina to Cape Town, how much time it will take you on a pure electric vehicles to be able to conclude that particular trip, and how much time you'll be expected to stop along the road to be able to recharge your battery and so on. So battery technology, like we've seen with cell phones and many other technologies, is improving year on year, and we are hopeful that we'll obviously be in a position to be able to have a battery technology that can be able to make people more comfortable to be able to come into this space as quickly as possible. And I think as an industry, we are hopeful that once we have finalized the green paper process, we'll certainly be in a position to be in a far better place than we currently are. And when you look at the plug-in production on the bottom of that particular slide, that is obviously going to shoot quite very high, particularly in 2021, because 3 of the 7 manufacturers in South Africa are now producing plug-in hybrid vehicles in the country. We've got a Toyota Corolla Cross, we've got the Mercedes-Benz hybrid model now, and Ford Motor Company is also introducing a new generation Ford Ranger, the beginning of next year, and we're hopeful that the production levels from all these companies will significantly increase as we adopt, obviously, the future of the of new energy vehicles in South Africa. In conclusion, Thabang, we believe very strongly that the future of new energy vehicles in South Africa is bright. We do not take for granted that, and I took pains to obviously take people through the evolution of revolutions. And we are obviously cognizant that that particular journey, from the first industrial revolution up until now, it's not going to come without its own challenges. It is how we embrace those challenges as government, as industry, as labor unions, and as society, so that we can really be able to work together in making sure that this electromobility is able to be fast-tracked and South Africa is able to benefit quite significantly out of it. We believe very strongly that as a country, we've got fantastic opportunities. If you look at the fact that we've just signed at the beginning of this year, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and the fact that Africa is now open for business through a free trade area, we certainly believe that we are going to become a very important engine to be able to supply new energy vehicles across the continent and be able to work with all our partners to be able to make sure that this reality of introducing and also transforming our industry into a cleaner, safer, more agile industry is actually realized. With those few words, thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to further conversation and engagement from the other members of the panel. Thank you very much, Ntate Mahlangu.
Thank you so much. That is Michael Mabasa, the man at the center of the automotive industry, representing a number of brands, representing some associate and affiliate members, and really at the center of thought leadership around the transition to EV. He's taken us through the contribution of the sector to GDP and to employment factors, some of the main investments that have come in the last couple of months from some OEMs, including Ford, including Mercedes, as well as Toyota. He's made some thought-provoking insights around the speed of change that we expect to have in the industry, and he's challenged us all to reimagine the future today as partners. I see our attendant numbers. We've got a lot of people that have just joined. Welcome to the Nedbank Energy Dialogue webinar. Our keynote speaker will be Mr. MEC Jacob Mamabulo, that will speak after Mr. Mkhululi Mlotha, who is the Chief Director at the DTIC, will provide some insights to us from a policy perspective, from a government perspective. Please keep typing your questions into the chat. We'll take some questions at the end as well. Mr. Mlotha, very good to have you here today, and we're interested to hear more about the DTIC's stance on electric vehicles. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity. Let me also greet the MEC, Mr. MEC Mamabolo, and all the other speakers and everybody on the webinar. Mr. Mabasa has kind of provided a very broad and detailed context. For me, it will be just focusing on what the DTIC as part of government is currently engaged with. But perhaps going through to the next slide, I will structure my presentation on briefly on what drives us to get involved, what interests us in electric vehicles, talk about the government role as envisaged in some of the documents, and also provide some progress of what has happened and been achieved so far. And lastly, to talk briefly about the work in progress. So if we go to the next slide, as Mr. Mabasa has indicated, there are concerns around the impact of global warming. As we have seen climate change over time, the floods that are there, the changing weather patterns, and a few other anomalies or what is out of the normal in as far as the weather conditions, and all this in the main due to the harmful gases that are being emitted into the environment. And we know that the automotive industry, as Mr. Mabasa has alluded to, is a significant contributor to such pollution. And secondly, as the countries and regions seek to mitigate the impact of the climate change, certain decisions that affect us as South Africa, as the automotive industry, are being taken elsewhere. And we have to respond. And also as a country, we are part of the globe. We can't just sit back and say, well, it does not affect us. And some studies actually indicate that we in Africa are going to bear the brunt of global warming. So we have to take action. And lastly, we are dealing with a very globalized industry in the automotive sector. As Mr. Mabasa has indicated, we currently export more than 60% of what we produce in South Africa. And at the same time, what we consume in the automotive sector in South Africa is also in the main imported from elsewhere, be it components, be it fully built up vehicles that we see on our roads. So as decisions are taken at the head offices of the various vehicle assemblers, it directly affects us in South Africa. Notwithstanding that, as South Africa, we're quite a small player in the auto industry, less than 1%, roughly at about 0.6% of the global market, both in terms of production and vehicle consumption. The next slide talks to actually what is or what should be the role of government in as far as electric vehicles or broadly new energy vehicles, which tend to be more efficient than the current internal combustion engines. What should be the government's role? Our role is captured in the Green Transport Strategy, which was promulgated by the Department of Transport almost 4 years ago, 5 years ago, which looks at the period 2018 to 2050 for a transition to cleaner transportation for South Africa. Roughly 6 areas are indicated as what will assist South Africa to grow the uptake of EVs in the country. Firstly, as a producer of motor vehicles, as a player in the assembly and trade of vehicles, South Africa, we need to ensure that we support the production of such vehicles in the country. It would be through a number of various interventions, from the policies to incentives, so that those vehicles can be produced in the country, can be sold in South Africa. Secondly, we also need to do some work to support the shift or the transition towards EVs. And therefore, we need to make sure that our research institutions develop the capability to conduct research on EVs and the various components such as the EV batteries and the management system of such vehicles. Thirdly, working across all government and various regulatory authorities, we need to ensure that there is an uptake of these vehicles, uptake and use of such vehicles in the country, in line also with the South African Automotive Masterplan, which amongst other things seeks to ensure that more is done locally. That is, the value addition that goes into this industry increases over time, and that the volumes that we produce, both for the domestic and export market, also increases, because that is the only way in which we can secure the employment in the sector and actually grow it. Next would be also a support for converting the old technology vehicles that emit, that have got high levels of emissions, that can be retrofitted with energy efficient technologies. An example in this regard would be a situation where some of the buses that are used by the cities, for example, as they come to their end of life, there is an opportunity to take out those diesel engines, but replace them with a new electric vehicle motors, and you can keep those vehicles on the road with even lesser emissions going forward. That is a possibility. That is something that needs to be explored. And it's not only limited to buses, by the way. We know in South Africa, most of our commuters and workers use taxis. It is also possible to convert some of those combis or taxis to use more energy efficient technologies, be it pure electric battery vehicles, be it natural gas, and so on. So we also need to focus on that. The next one would be also considering supporting beneficiation of our local resources that we have in the country. We have a lot of resources that can be used in the production of batteries, for example. So we need to steer the industry in a way that beneficiates such materials, because also in that at that level, you can create not only foreign exchange for the country, but also a lot of jobs. Instead of just exporting our raw materials to other countries to import components at a higher price then later on, it is something that we need to seriously consider to add value on those resources, on those minerals in South Africa. And lastly, we also have to ensure that we support the establishment and development of local vehicle manufacturers as well as local component suppliers. Currently, the major elements, the major participants in the automotive industry are all multinationals. But in the past few years, we've seen that there is a possibility of creating new players in that space. You would know that in the past there was a local electric vehicle that was developed in South Africa by South Africans. However, for a number of reasons that didn't go to market, but we still have that skill and know-how in the country, and therefore we also need to nurture such. So basically that would be a government's role as captured in the Green Transport Strategy, but then it calls for a government-wide approach to this. It is not only the DTI, nor DTI and the Department of Transport only, but government broadly has a role to play in this regard. But let's look at what has happened so far. We can unpack again the role, or the role of government will also be evident in some of the activities that I'm going to talk to now. It is not only under COVID that we're looking at electric vehicles. In 2015, the DTI then issued a draft for public consultation on a South African electric vehicle roadmap. We were looking at firstly creating an environment that would allow the use and manufacturing of electric vehicles and their components in the country. That process, however, was to some degree suspended on the realization that perhaps as South Africa we're not yet ready for the full transition to EVs by then. And instead, we subsequently focused on developing a broad master plan for the automotive sector. However, following that roadmap publication and interaction with the stakeholders and the public, we did a few things. We changed the legislation to the extent that currently, or from 2016, we do have electric vehicles on our road. So there had to be some amendments to the regulations to allow the operation of such vehicles on our roads. That was done. And therefore, a few OEMs are distributing electric vehicles on our roads, as Mr. Mabaso has provided the figures. this talks to such. But following on the EV roadmap, the National Department of Transport came up with the Green Transport Strategy, on which the role of government is kind of indicated, as the previous slide spoke to. This created a high-level framework for policy direction as well in this space. And currently working with the Department of Transport, we are putting in action plans around the implementation of the Green Transport Strategy. The strategy broadly is there, so currently we are coming up with action plans that will be implemented going forward. And lastly, in the last couple of years, working with a research institute, Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies in South Africa, that is TIPS. We are still exploring how we can viably transition from the current ICE vehicles, that is the internal combustion engines, to electric vehicles, both in terms of operation and all, but of interest to us would be on the manufacturing side. Remember, on manufacturing, we have more than 100,000 people directly employed by the auto industry. And therefore, for us, that is a key priority for the DTIC to protect the industry, because we know that in the major markets to which the industry exports, some countries have put up already indications that in the next few years, they will not allow the distribution of internal combustion engines. And therefore, we have to transition and start producing those EVs locally so that we can keep the industry active. Otherwise, we might lose some of the local manufacturers. Now, what is currently happening in this space? In May of this year, we issued out an automotive green paper on new energy vehicles for public comment. And we're looking basically on 3 areas in this green paper on how we can best stimulate local production of electric vehicles, of hybrids, as well as the components that go into those vehicles. So one, there's a focus on manufacturing, but secondly, we're looking at how we can encourage the uptake, how we can stimulate demand so that we don't only service exports, but we also use those vehicles on our roads, and we contribute towards limiting or lessening the impact of harmful gases in the environment. And lastly, we need to continue supporting and creating a conducive environment for investment in this sector. As I indicated, mostly this is a sector dominated by multinationals. So we need to ensure that the environment is good for them to invest in the country. Following the publication of the Green Paper in May, we received a number of inputs from stakeholders and the public by the middle of June. We engaged with such inputs, and mostly they are supportive of the direction the department and government is taking towards supporting electric vehicles and other new energy vehicles, that is your hybrids of different extents. However, we saw a need still that through an evidence-based analysis, we need to develop a clearer, pointed policy that will support electric vehicles and other new energy vehicles in the country. So working with TIPS and some other consultants, and also in consultations with key stakeholders, we are in that process of developing a policy. a policy which should, in the very near future, be submitted to Cabinet for approval. And following on that, it is our hope and wish and our target that we should be in a position in a few months to issue out our roadmap as South Africa on how we're going to transition to e-mobility, and provide also some details on the support that will be provided by government. Initially, when we issued the green paper, we had a target that by the end of last month, which is October, we should have gone to Cabinet. However, the industry consultations and the work that needs to be done and concluded meant that there is a slight delay. However, before the end of the calendar year, we should have something to share with Cabinet and hopefully get a direction going forward. So briefly, that is where government is at in terms of supporting electric vehicles. I guess further details would come in through discussions and questions, because I'm sure one would be interested as to exactly how do we see this demand being stimulated? How do we see actually that we will support localization of the manufacture of these vehicles in South Africa, noting that we are far from major markets and also we are relatively quite small. We're producing around 600,000 units per annum, whilst the global industry is in excess of 80 million units. So those would some of the key areas that we're looking at additionally to what is currently in place. As you would know, we have been supporting the automotive industry over time. And since '94, we've had two programs in the main. The Motor Industry Development Program, which in 2012 was changed to the APDP, the Automotive Production and Development Program, which was recently revised to be APDP2, which is what in the main is used to support the local automotive manufacturing industry. So we will consider elements of that and others to support the uptake and production of EVs. With that, Thabang, let me leave it there. Some more can be shared as we go into the discussions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mkhululi-Mlotha. As MEC Jacob Mamabulo gets ready and goes on camera and unmutes, I think Mr. Mlotha has shared some good insights around the environmental impacts and drivers for the strategy. I think he also spoke about the green transport strategy headed by the Department of Transport and the key actions therein, including beneficiation, incentive management, research, amongst others. And he's assured us and has explained around the work that's happening in the back end in order to drive EV adoption, with a roadmap and a strategy being in the works for sign off by Cabinet in the next coming month. I think it's all very encouraging that there is work happening in the background, and that is to be commended. MEC Jacob Mamabulo, can you please go onto camera as well as unmute yourself so that our participants can see you. As I've said at the top of the meeting, the MEC is our keynote address for today. On the live chat, I'm getting a lot of questions for different, some for Mr. Mabasa, some for our MEC, and some for Mr. Mlota. So it's going to be interesting when we get to Q&A. MEC, we thank you so much today for joining us to give us the keynote address around electric vehicle and how Department of Transport and Roads and Gauteng sees this subsector of the automotive section. We've got quite a good number of attendants all waiting to listen to yourself and our other speakers. MEC, please go ahead, and thank you for joining us.
Well, so firstly, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and good day to you, to all the panel members, to everybody participating in the webinar, and of course to the people of our province and of course the country. My sincere greetings to all of you. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is to greet and acknowledge already the good inputs you have had, which have been very educational to me. I've already learned a lot. I must commend the quality, the manner in which the presentations are made, and the good information that is there, made by Mr. Mabasa, and of course our Chief Director, and let me also just greet Mr. Theo Malele, the colleague I work with in the taxi industry, and of course Stephen Potgieter, and just acknowledge all of them, and looking forward also to their inputs. Now, for us, I must concede speaking for 20 minutes might be a bit difficult. So I want to plead with you to make sure that you know, you monitor me on time, and I'm going to try to be brief so that we can allow people to interact and engage with us. Now, let me also just take the opportunity to really commend Nedbank for organizing a very important webinar at an important time. And this is a very important time because, as you will know, the entire globe and the world is focused on the issues of climate change, and the eyes of the world are fixed on a very important event that is taking place, COP26. That's a very important globe. So the timing of this webinar is very much important because it locates us squarely within the conversations that are taking place in the world. I also just want to say to you that we are meeting immediately after the local government elections. So that's a very important matter we must have on the back of our minds. But most importantly, I want to remind everybody that as we talk about recovery, economic recovery, and how to reposition mobility, we mustn't forget that we are still deep in COVID-19. And that the country is talking about, for us in South Africa, possibly the fourth wave of COVID-19. And of course, it's critical that we look at the vaccination program because, as the president of our country has directed all of us, we must make sure that we support vaccination to make sure that we don't go into the fourth wave, and the risk there is another hard lockdown. That is going to have a severe impact on the discussions you are having, because for us to reposition mobility and make sure that we can introduce electrical vehicles at a pace and scale that I heard Mr. Mabasa talking to, COVID-19 lockdown in the fourth wave will definitely have a negative and devastating impact. So we mustn't forget about that. Now, I also just want to say to you that, you know, the inputs that have been made, especially by our Chief Director, Mlota, is that we, as government, and that's one issue I wanted to talk to, just quickly. The policy environment, the regulatory environment, and the commitment of government to electrical vehicles, there is no doubt about that. Government support the rollout of electric vehicles as a way to combat the negative impact of greenhouse gas emissions. So that part, I think we can take it as done, that government has laid out a very clear policy. And I will not focus on that because I think that matter has been adequately dealt with. But the significant part for us in Gauteng province is that we have a provincial policy directive that we call Growing Gauteng Together towards 2030. We call it GGT 2030, and this is the point of reference for all the work we do in the province as a provincial government. And I would like to say that for us as the Department of Roads and Transport in Gauteng, we have adopted our own contribution to Growing Gauteng Together 2030. We have a policy that we have launched in 2020, which we call, this was in October, 2020 Transport Month. We launched what we call Growing Gauteng Together through smart mobility. Now, this is a policy document, our roadmap as to how are we going to grow Gauteng together. And we have published that. And this was during the Transport Month last year when we hosted the Africa chapter of the Global Smart Mobility Conference. Now, I'd like to say to you, Program Director, that our province is a very proud host of Global Smart Mobility, the Africa chapter of it. It's hosted by us as a department. We have hosted 3 of them already. And in all of them, I would like to say to the listeners, the focus was on the rollout and introduction of electric vehicles. And we had the opportunity in all of them except last year and this year to have a physical interaction with original manufacturers of vehicles who were able to display the technology and where they are with respect to electrical vehicles. So as a province, we have adopted a concept of smart mobility to be part of the global community, migrating from the risk of climate change and into making sure that we play our part in saving and protecting the climate. So your invitation to us is really highly appreciated because we consider ourselves to be part and parcel of the global community that's migrating towards doing away with the internal combustion engine and supporting electrical vehicles, because that is what the world is talking about. Smart mobility and electric vehicles are a critical component of that. So from a policy point of view in the province, I just want to say, and the practical steps that we have taken and we are taking, I want to say to you that we are part and parcel and we're fully at the center of the international movement towards a better, safer environment. And I'd like to ask the audience to take time to look at our document. It's an overarching broad policy statement that actually indicates how we want to change mobility patterns in the province. Now, having said that, I would like to challenge the webinar because a webinar is a platform of discourse, engagements, discussions. So we must have some bit of scholarly interactions on what do we think is the best way to move forward. So I appreciate the slides, but we must also have, you know, what I call a discourse on the issues that we are discussing. And I'd like to challenge everybody in the webinar that let's have some engagements and discussions and see how far we can find consensus on the range of issues we'd like to raise. So what is my first proposal? And of course, my thesis on what is to be done. My proposal will be that if we want to be successful in rolling out electric vehicles and making sure that they are part and parcel of mobility in this country, I think we must focus our attention on one critical issue. And I've not heard my panelists talking much to it. If they did, they'll pardon me, I didn't hear them well. I think they'll need to clarify it. And that is the issue about focusing on the choices and the preferences of the people. Because at the end, it is the people that must buy electric vehicles. And I am saying that unless we focus on changing the taste and attitudes and the behavior, the conduct, the understanding of the people, we will not make progress. And I'm challenging all, all members of NAMSA, all original manufacturers, all the distributors, all of us, that we must focus on the end user, on the client, on the buyer, on the people. That's where we should focus if we are to be successful. And I want to argue that the rest of the issues are not critical as that one. And I stand to be engaged on that issue. The reason why I'm saying this is that this year, as part of our transport month, just last month, we hosted an international event. As I said, we host smart mobility events. And one of the issues that I saw listening to people is that there's an issue of trust by the people about electric vehicles, the issue of confidence by people in electric vehicles. And one of these issues has got to do with the following points. And the most critical one is not so much the regulatory environment and many other issues that have been raised. I think the issue of the infrastructure to charge electric vehicles, for me, is what good people call the elephant in the room. Because if we do not deal with this issue of trust in the electric vehicles, and critical to that is infrastructure to charge the battery, we're going to have difficulties. And I want to benchmark this on my experience with having worked with the automotive industry, and I still do now, on the rollout of vaccination. I heard one of the colleagues talking about the taxi industry. Mr. Malele will talk about that is his sector. But I have seen that if we do not invest time and resources and energy talking to people to change their views and perceptions and the reality before them about vaccination, we are not going to reach the target that we need to avoid the fourth wave. And that same analogy applies to electric vehicles, because there are three things here about infrastructure. Its availability across the length and breadth of the country. Availability, accessibility. The easiest way in which people can trust that if I travel to any part of the country with my electric vehicle, I'll be able to find a facility to charge the battery. As people plan their trips. Currently, with the internal combustion engine, people know there must be a filling station somewhere. So accessibility of infrastructure to charge is a critical issue. That talks to the quantity of sites in the country to charge electrical vehicles. Are we dealing with that issue to build confidence? I'm not hearing so much about it, perhaps because I came late. The second issue related to infrastructure is the performance of the battery or the charging facilities in terms of how many kilometers can they lead me when I've charged? How long do I travel with the battery? What distance can I travel before I get into trouble? So how long does it last me? Before the next one, and where is the next one? Do we have geo coordinates? Like, can I Google the next charging station? Where is it? And find and know that it's in so many kilometers. I'll find one. So the issue of their performance, the quality, how long will it last me? That is very much important. So that talks to the issue of time. For how long can this take me? How far can it take me? Which is the issue of quality. How far time? And the issue of cost. Are the costs related to these issues? What is the investment I need to make in order to have adequate resources to charge? In addition to the car itself, and how much does the car cost? I guess that with economies of scale, those issues can be sorted, of costs and of course scaling up on production. But please understand me, because the problem with this type of platforms and discourse and engagements is that you might be misunderstood. So I need to clarify that the issues I'm raising, I'm not saying they are they can't be resolved. What I'm saying is they are critical to creating trust and confidence of the people that this is the way to go, and making it easy for them to say, I vote with my money, I go for electric vehicles. And of course, for Nedbank, could also be talking to us about how easy will be the criteria and the credit, the credit engine to test if I qualify for credit to buy an electric vehicle. What will be the interest rate compared to the current regime? To the current interest rates on a vehicle? What will be the credit terms and conditions? And will the same risk engine be applied to people who want to apply to buy an electric vehicle at Nedbank as a critical financier of vehicles currently? Are there going to be changes? And how will Nedbank talk to me as the buyer? Because if there can just be a perception that they are too costly, complicated in interest rates, and the criteria is going to be difficult, those issues are going to lead us exactly where we are with the difficulties of vaccination, because we have not invested time, energy, resources on educating the public, on making it easy for them to understand, on assuring them. So I'm saying this is my thesis and my contribution to the meeting, and perhaps I must call on the experts, because they are here, to help me clarify these questions as more than the issue. So I wanted to talk about what we are going to do as the provincial government of Gauteng, but I can see my time is gone. Maybe in 1 minute, if you permit me, I'll say to you, I have appointed a task team led by Mr. Jack van der Merwe, who was the CEO of Gauteng Management Agency and is now leading the Gauteng Transport Authority. I have appointed him to lead a team in the department to help us move one step with regard to particularly electric vehicle as it relates to our fleet. Because remember that we run a fleet of cars at G-Fleet. So we are the custodian of government cars. And secondly, Gautrain runs a massive fleet as well. And it is also the rail backbone that we are using to migrate people from the road into the rail network, so that the road network, as their biggest culprit in greenhouse gas emissions, can actually start to reduce. Because we need to get people, every single car on the road, it is emitting and it is endangering the climate. And we are saying to people, migrate to Gautrain, because in that way you are saving the climate. But in addition to that, we want to look at our own fleet, because one of the issues that is driving us in the province is the understanding that if as government we do not lead and build confidence in electric vehicles as government, it will be very difficult for people to follow. So we as the provincial government, we must start with our own fleet. We must start with our own cars. We must be the leading buyer of electric vehicles, and G-Fleet, Gautrain, and of course we are going to look at public transport. And I want to say to Mr. Theo Malele that I was addressing one of the associations of the taxi industry today in Soweto before I came here. And when I told them that electric vehicles are coming and they must be ready for that, they almost fell from their chairs. And I told them, these cars that you are driving old technology. The world is moving in a different direction. The buses that we have, like Patco and many others that we are subsidizing, they will have to migrate to more cleaner resources. The municipalities are running their own fleet of buses, of cars. So we as the provincial government must lead by example, particularly our department. And we have also agreed that in this approach that we're looking at, I have asked Gautrain management agents that can't they make sure that Gautrain stations are also installed with battery charging capabilities and infrastructure, so that if you are in the city of Tshwane, you can go to any Gautrain station and all. And Gautrain, by the way, is expanding to the townships. But that is a matter of future plans. Hoping that you can still hear me.
We can hear you perfectly, MEC. Please continue. We can hear you just fine. MEC, can you hear us? Can you hear me? We can see you and hear you, MEC. So when you can hear me, you can continue. MEC, we can see you and hear you just fine. If you want to continue. We can see you and hear you just fine, MEC, if you want to continue.
Yeah, in conclusion, I've taken a lot of your time. In conclusion, all I'm saying to you is, hoping that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I think let me conclude. I can rather take questions, if there will be any. But the point I was making was that we as government want to roll out and install infrastructure for charging. And we have commissioned a team to look at everything, including value chains and working with the automotive sector. So to that extent, we will make an announcement very soon about what is our practical plan, not theoretical broad policy statement. How many vehicles are we going to buy when? When will the first charging stations be installed? How will that be done? And what are the timelines? So we want to lead in driving the confidence, improving positive sentiment on electric vehicles, because this is the best way to go. We don't want our country to find itself. With Eskom, people say, over the years, we have been solving this problem. Didn't we know there will be these challenges? Now, the world is going to lock us out. Very soon, people in the world will say, I'll not buy a product from that country if their footprint and contribution of greenhouse gas emissions is too high. Now, in transport, we want to play our part. Make sure that we lead by example and thank you very much. Let me leave it here.
That is MEC Jacob Mamapulo really taking us through some of the practicalities of EV. MEC, you have challenged a dialogue, and I'm going to take you on that dialogue. Please, let's get the MEC back onto the call. Let me ask my colleague to follow up. He's wanted some discussion, and we need to take him up on that. I'm seeing a lot of good questions on the forum. If you see me looking like I'm clicking through, I am reading the questions and preparing for the Q&A at the end of every speaker. But we'd like to thank the MEC really emphasizing and giving the notion that we have to be client-centric and customer-centric in how we look at EVs. He's talking about the charging infrastructure. He's talking about the cost and how we as banks will enable this. Really challenging us and giving his own team within the Gauteng Department of Transport and Roads. He's challenged them to say that in order for adoption to happen, the department in Gauteng needs to lead from the front via Gautrain, via G-Fleet. And MEC, I see that you are back. I'm going to challenge you to invite us as Nedbank to be a partner of choice in those discussions, because we are looking at solutions in supporting adoption. But before we go there, we've got two more speakers to everyone on the line. Keep your questions coming. I'll take them one by one. You do not have to repeat questions. I see them all and I'm reading them, and I'm going to take it to the panel when we finish, as the MEC has challenged us to engage. The next speaker on the line from the Gauteng National Taxi Alliance is Mr. Theo Malele. He's joining us on his phone, so he won't be on camera. However, he'll just take us through a few of the points from a mass transport and a taxi perspective on how we can enable the rollout of EV fleets. Thank you very much, Mr. Theo Malele. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon to the MEC. Good afternoon to fellow panelists and all those that have actually joined us during this, webinar. I am essentially going to talk to three things. I'll quickly take you through our background as who we are and traverse our problem statement with yourselves, and then conclude with possible solutions to the problematic statements that I would have put across. Without any further ado, the National Taxi Alliance is a body corporate formed to defend and articulate the wishes and aspirations of its taxi operators. And our footprint stretches throughout the country, with the exception of the Western Cape. And obviously, in the Gauteng province, we command quite a huge support base. And we basically hold democratic elections every 5 years as an organization. That then speaks to us exactly who we are as the National Taxi Alliance. What we have actually envisaged, that is now on the next slide, the problem statement. It says, it is estimated that there are over 250,000 minibus taxis in the country. And currently, the sales of minibus taxis are around 4,000 taxis per month. That then gives us an additional 48,000 new taxis that are actually brought on an annual basis. And the other issue is that the aftermarket parts and the used vehicles that are shipped into the country, this further compounds the problem. We really believe that South Africa has been turned into a dumping ground. If you look at the the second-hand engines and parts that are actually being sold in these big cities and small cities, in the townships, almost everywhere. There are parts of used vehicles that are being shipped from overseas into the country, and this is going to become a problem because we now need to also have a way of, calling all these old parts, maybe trying to recycle them. It's another educational drive. And we also have learned that we contribute about 25% of our carbon through emissions as a transport sector. And we've also noted that, in this country, you see even smoking vehicles, doing the rounds, and this is an eyesore, and people seem not to care. And another, issue is that of the law enforcement agencies that tend to hide themselves and begin to stop vehicles during ungodly hours. This has, a negative impact on the economy of the country and on the environment. Now, with regards to the economy, once a vehicle is being stopped during peak hours, a taxi in this respect, other road users tend to slow down, stop, and actually see as to what is this that is happening on the side of the road, and that in itself then brings traffic into a standstill. And while these vehicles are stationary, they emit emissions into the environment, and people that are economically active are being stagnated in those vehicles. So this has a negative impact on us. So we need to also get our law enforcement agencies to be educated around environmental degradation. And we basically, are saying all this can be, achieved if you then move on to the other slide, the next slide, that speaks to a possible solution. So with regards to solutions to our problems, the current old fleet will have to be replaced with affordable electric vehicles. I think the MEC has alluded or spoken, a bit on that. The question of affordability cannot be overemphasized. We need to relook at that so that our people can buy into this concept of EVs. And as I said, the Western world needs to be stopped from shipping old vehicles, in aftermarket space onto our shores. While they're busy cleaning their environment, they're actually throwing all the rubbish into our shore. As I said earlier on, we also need to ensure that vehicles do not, or rather are not allowed to drive on the roads, with excessive smoke coming through their tailpipes. And we've also learned that there is a product called extreme fuel treatment that was actually used by NASA, and it actually got a Nobel Peace Prize for having helped, the jet into space and safely back onto Mother Earth. These products actually save 33% of emissions. We really believe that as an interim measure, whilst we're waiting for this drastic change that will take place, there has to be other mitigating strategies that we need to deploy in order for us to be able to begin to reduce our carbon footprints onto the environment. And we also, as a possible solution, would want to say that waste management and recycling needs to be part of the curricula so that everybody knows and understands the impact that these have onto the environment. And public really has to be sensitized on the importance of saving the planet. There are many instances where you find that in the townships or near taxi ranks or near backyard mechanic, there's disposing of old oil. It gets discarded onto onto the ground, and that piece of ground will never be rehabilitated again. And at times, some would actually throw it into the stormwater drainage system, and that then pollutes our water. And people really do not think that this is possible, that water gets polluted. If you talk to people, they'll always tell you that there is just abundance of water. There's rain. Why complain about water when God provides us with water? So you also have a problem of lights that have been kept on during the day, when natural light could be allowed to actually strike into most of these public transport spaces. So we need to look at that to reduce our demand from the grid. That is, that results in the current situations that we are in. As I'm speaking to you in the darkness in our offices because of load shedding. As I'm about to conclude, you are saying, the new vehicle manufacturing and sales would have to be discouraged in all respects. And the taxi industry needs a chair around NAMSA. We are saying OEMs need to involve the taxi industry when developing tools of its trade. The taxi industry will no longer want to be consumers of products that they are not part of their design. And we basically are saying that nothing for us without us. As I close, I'll say, there's a saying that says, true genius is found in simplicity. And we are, as an industry, ready for the fourth industrial revolution in order to save Mother Nature. Because without us saving Mother Nature, future generations would not have an environment for their own habitation. And this is a reality that has not begun to sink into many people. Because if you start asking people or talking to people about environmental degradation, they will tell you that it is government's responsibility. So a huge, serious educational drive on the environmental, awareness needs to be done. Some people would actually be born and even pass on without even have planted a tree during Arbor Day. People use so much paper, but they'll never plant a tree. So we need a concerted effort to get everybody to understand the real serious challenges that the world is facing today, of ensuring that we make sure that future generations do have a space in which to survive. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me then perhaps step back and allow for questions, if there are any, for us to begin to engage much more broadly. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Theo Malele, a spokesperson at the Taxi Alliance, talking to us about some of the problem statements that are affecting EV adoption, and then also taking us through some of the solutions that he sees in the space, including more public awareness, including the engagement of the taxi industry in developing solution, in looking at opportunities for fleet replacement, and then as well as curriculum enhancement to ensure that there's an understanding of environmental. And a very interesting point there around the XFT, this technology that's developed by NASA. Mr. Theo Malele, please stay online. We're going to take some question, but now I've got my colleague. Thank you for everyone that's been attentively listening to us on the podcast. My name is Thabang Mahlangu. I'm the sector lead at Nedbank for automotive, transport and fleet, and we are hosting this webinar today to drive thought leadership around electric vehicles. to express our commitment as Nedbank to e-mobility and to stakeholder partnerships in the space. I've got my colleague Stefan Potgieter from he's the executive responsible for asset ownership at Nedbank Retail Bank, along with our colleagues at MFC. He's going to talk to us about the financing, the transition of internal combustion engines to EV. Stefan, thank you very much for having you today. Please take us through your content. We appreciate your presence.
Thank you, Tabang, and thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and also good afternoon to my fellow panel members, Mr. Mamabola, Mr. Mbasa, Mr. Mlota, and Mr. Malele. Welcome to everyone. I think to Mr. Mamabola's challenge, I think on the Nedbank side, we've got a great responsibility, given that we're financing, over 37% of all new and used vehicles currently on the road. So, I think, in reflecting, we've got a major responsibility to really make a difference in terms of climate change and specifically on the topic matter today of electric vehicles. All right, so let's jump straight into the presentation. I think first of all, in South Africa, I think there's a big perception towards electronic vehicles. Specifically, electronic vehicles powered by electricity generated by coal-fired power stations. So I think for me that's an important part to cover, and therefore the 4 evident truths that will dispel this perception, which means powering electric vehicles with coal-fired electricity is superior to powering conventional combustion engine vehicles. I'll briefly go into the 4 evident truths that almost dispel this perception. Then I think thirdly, I definitely want to cover hybrids. I think hybrid vehicles are not aiding the transition, as it still has a combustion engine burning fossil fuel to charge the electric engine. And therefore we should really focus on the products that really make the big difference. For example, the plug-in electric vehicles. And then I think lastly, my panel members have already covered the significant challenges we've got, not only in terms of the OEM, the product space, but I think also in terms of the infrastructure and regulatory environment. I think, and also very importantly, I think what Mr. Mamabola raised in terms of focusing on the people. I think currently the electronic vehicles are very, very expensive. If you look at MFC, our average vehicle financing price currently is around about 270,000. And I'm going to illustrate a little bit later. I think the majority of electronic vehicles are very close to the R1 million mark. So affordability is definitely going to have to be a focus from all perspectives. Next slide, please. Right, so I think let's focus on the 4 self-evident truths when considering electricity versus petrol diesel mobility. And I think the truths indicate that for any given resource, either coal, oil, natural gas, from any energy efficiency and emissions control perspective, it is always better to have fewer, larger stationary combustion facilities running at a constant load. For example, compared to many mobile combustion facilities running at a variable load. So I think the 4 main points that we need to cover is first on the top left, large is better than small. So I think always gigawatt and megawatt scale engines are running always hotter, therefore more efficient compared to our normal vehicle kilowatt scale engines. I think secondly, constant load is better than variable load. So combustion engines have an optimal operating load, which should be maintained for as long as possible, so much more efficient. Thirdly, stationary is better than mobile. I think for practical reasons, it's always easier to manage and reduce emissions from a stationary source, for example, compared to mobile sources. And then lastly, fewer better than many. The fewer sources of emissions we've got is always much better compared to many mobile units on the roads. I think therefore, in conclusion, powering electric vehicles with coal-fired electricity is always superior to powering conventional combustion engine vehicles with coal to liquid fuel. Next slide, please. Why doesn't it make sense to focus on the hybrids? I think for everyone, and Mr. Mbaso shared the volumes, the sales volumes. I think there's very minimal, but there's also a lot of hybrid vehicles currently on sale, much more than electronic vehicles. And I think the challenge for us on the hybrid side is a hybrid car uses fuel to run an engine which charges a large battery, which then ultimately drives the car forward. You know, this is no different to any other domestic generator in a car with an inverter. So I think once again, I think the focus would really be to focus on the products that really makes a real difference. And for example, that would be the plug-in EV products. Next slide, please. Just to add on to Mr. Bombaso's annual sales numbers on EVs, I think if we look at the last period since 2013, there's only one electric vehicle sold per close to 100,000 people. If you look at the real numbers, and I mean they hardly register on the radar. And I think so far over 70% of that was predominantly the BMW i3, and once again, you know, the affordability hurdle. Next slide, please. All right, let's just focus on a few, you know, of the recent media briefings that came out. And I think obviously everyone saw the e-Golf. Now, once again, very exciting that the e-Golf will come to South Africa. But I think once again, the hurdle, the e-Golf won't be sold in South Africa. And I think that's where we almost need to have a bit of a change in mindset, specifically on the OEM side, to say, yes, we can produce the EVs on local turf, but we also need to sell them, and we need to have an affordability product out in the market. And then I think to the far right, where Mr. Malota touched on, I think there's really focus from the government side now to really make it happen in terms of the green paper. You know, what can we do in terms of import tariffs? What can we do in terms of government and local government subsidies? So I think there's a lot of action and a lot of momentum currently happening. Next slide, please. Yeah, I just want to use this as another example. I think a lot of exciting products coming from overseas. I think this one is example, the Volkswagen ID4. And I think the intention is for VW SA to actually bring it here and sell it locally. But I mean, we definitely need to make that happen. If we can maybe just focus on the current fully plug-in EVs on sale in the market. I think you can look at the top. I think the Mini Cooper is probably the most affordable at close to 700,000 without options. If you look at the majority, you know, close to R1 million. And then once again, you know, I think if we look at MFC's average financing amount of around about 270,000, you know, that's completely unaffordable. So I think that's a major challenge for us. You know, if we want to focus on people and if we really want to make a difference, you know, there's no way we can achieve that if we don't make the product affordable in South Africa. All right, what do we need to overcome to make that happen? So I think first of all, my fellow panel members have touched on all the work that we're currently doing in terms of government regulation. I think new vehicles, I mean, everyone knows that to follow the homologation process takes at least 36 months, you know, so how can we fast track that and make sure that these cars arrive sooner to our shores? I think a lot of work we need to do on the import tax side to actually make it much more affordable, not to penalize, but actually to subsidize electronic vehicles. A lot of work around the dealers. I think it's a completely different ballgame of maintaining electronic vehicle versus a normal ICE vehicle. So, you know, we have to repurpose our workshops. So I think that's also important that we're proactive on that. And then lastly, I think the recycling of batteries, you know, obviously we've touched on that earlier, you know, that needs to be industry by itself. And then lastly, obviously, you know, we're all living under load shedding over the last few days. I think we need to ensure a consistent support from Eskom, you know, otherwise it makes it so much difficult for us to really drive and the trust factor in terms of EVs. The key challenges from an MFC and Nedbank perspective, you know, I think firstly, and, you know, I want to touch on what Mr. Mamabola said in terms of, you know, will the banks use different scorecards and different pricing in terms of EVs? That's definitely not the case. I think we use exactly the same scorecard, exactly the same risk lens, and there's even a pricing benefit. You know, I think if you look at the maintenance costs on an EV versus an IC unit. So there's definitely a affordability cost that can be taken into account on the credit side. So from a bank's perspective, the moment we get the affordable EVs in the market, we'll do everything from our part to really make the financing easy for the consumers, not to penalize the consumers. And the same thing would apply on the Nedbank insurance side. You know, I think in terms of the premiums, it doesn't help if you provide an affordable financing solution for EVs, but you penalize on the insurance side. So I think it's not only a financing solution, but also an insurance solution to make sure we solve ultimately for the people. I think just in closing, I just want to take up the challenge from Mr. Mamabola. I think on behalf of Nedbank and MFC, we definitely took notes of your main points. I think first of all, which I've just covered, affordability. If we cannot make it affordable, we're not going to really drive EVs in South Africa. So that's not only a bank's responsibility, OEM and government's responsibility, but we need to get the product affordable for our people. Secondly, we all need to work in order to get that trust in the product. And I think Mr. Malele touched on the taxi industry. You know, we need to get that trust from the industry. We need to get the trust from the buying public. And then thirdly, in terms of the infrastructure, it doesn't help if we've got the affordability and we've got the trust, but we don't really have the infrastructure to charge. So I think from a bigger perspective, and I think Tabang will also touch on that later, in terms of supporting the whole EV infrastructure across SA, is also going to be very, very critical for us to drive EVs going forward. So lastly, just in closing, we accept the challenge, and as part of MFC and Nedbank, we really want to make a difference in terms of the climate risk and specifically on supporting EVs in the market. Thank you, Tabang. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to have all the speakers go on camera. We're going to do a Q&A session now as we round up our discussion. So let's get that going in the interim. But thank you so much, Stefan. I think from a motor retail perspective, you touched on good points around how we can unlock value. But what's important is for us to work together to support some of these stakeholders, you know, on different aspects of it. I see Mr. Mlota is now online. I'm waiting for our MEC, Mr. Mabasa, as well, to go on screen, as well as who am I calling out next? Mr. Mabasa, you are the last one that is not on camera. There we go. Everyone is now on camera. Thank you very, very much to everyone. I'm going to start with, we've got a lot of questions. There's a few points that we won't touch on, but I just want to mention them just to show the level of engagement we are having on the live Q&A. A lot of people seem to want to discuss hydrogen. Mr. Mabasa, I saw fuel cell technology on your presentation, so that's interesting, but we'll defer that one. Some people, very advanced question talking about cyber security and the implication for vehicle-to-vehicle communication, right? I think we've got some very engaged people online. Others are talking about the impact of the AFCFTA, and how that's going to unlock volume, which is obviously outside of the scope of this, but engagement is always good for us to have. I think I'm going to start with the first question around government and incentives. Mr. Mlota, there's a person who made a very good point that says in governments, and you can unmute yourself, in countries where they've had high adoption, the government has not just incentivized OEMs and brands, they also give a benefit to the consumer in the sense of some tax credits and that kind of thing. Have we started to think about on both sides, if you talk about the incentive side first, and also the tax credit from a consumer side, and then as a final point, people are talking about duties payable. Someone on the line said it's about 42% duties for imported EVs, and that's a barrier, as Stefan has mentioned, the prices of the vehicles. So if you can take us through those 3 points from a policy perspective, an incentive perspective, a tax credit perspective, and duty perspective there. And I'm interested whether if the MEC also wants to weigh in when you're done, because his support will be paramount in lobbying national from a policy stance perspective. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Thabang, for the question. Government is looking at a variety of measures and interventions to support electric vehicles. Amongst those would be incentives aimed at demand stimulation, but also incentives aimed at supporting local manufacturing of vehicles and components thereof. On demand stimulation, we've seen a number of countries that we looked at in the process of research that are providing consumers direct subsidies as they acquire these electric vehicles. However, with all the kind of incentives that can be provided, with all the support that government is looking at, we need to ensure that it is something that we can afford. So affordability for the state is quite key. And you would know that our economy hasn't been doing that well in the past few years. And dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic as well has drained our resources. It meant we had to redirect resources in a particular direction in order to deal with this pandemic. And also we still have other priorities as a country, from providing basic services to ensuring that we maintain the assets of government. Currently, we are undergoing load shedding, stage 4. So we also need to support Eskom. Of course, Eskom is still using coal, and now there's another challenge that we need to steer Eskom towards renewables. So whilst we are looking at this, we need to make sure that whatever finally is taken as a decision and implemented by government is something that can be affordable for government with all the other priorities that are there. That then talks to details such as the import duties. All vehicles that are coming into the country are subjected to some form of taxation, be it the import duties, and of course we have preference or agreements with other jurisdictions like the European Union, where the duties are not the same as those that are coming from the rest of the world. So we need to also look into our affordability. Also considering that some of our programs as government are funded by the taxes and revenue that government at various levels charges. One other key consideration going forward for the state would be, how do we, for example, deal with the road accident fund, which gets funded also through a levy on fuel. Now, if we were to drive towards a situation where a significant portion of our vehicle fleet is electric vehicles, full-on battery electric vehicles, what would be the impact on such? So these are some of the issues that over time we need to take into the equation as we agree on the nature and the extent or the quantum of support that is provided. So, but for us as the DTIC, first and foremost, we need to ensure that the industry in South Africa, that is the automotive manufacturing, survives, is sustainable, because we can't afford to lose those 100,000 direct jobs, but there are more across the value chain jobs that are maintained by the presence of automotive manufacturing and the production of components. But secondly, in dealing with the environmental issues, we need to change into more energy efficient vehicles that are on our roads. So all these need to, it's a delicate balance that government needs to embark upon. So perhaps let me leave it there for now. I know there were other questions around infrastructure, but let me allow you to also interact with the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much there, Mr. Mlotha. On infrastructure, MEC, you called it the elephant in the room when you started. I was particularly interested when you spoke about a growing Gauteng Together GGT strategy, and you added as a department through smart mobility as you launched last year in October 2020. My question is, when you have your counterparts from other countries, other smart cities in the world, the infrastructure challenge becomes a chicken and egg situation. Do you build infrastructure first and then you get volume and throughput, or as the throughput increases, that should drive the increase and the need for infrastructure? What do you see as some of the benchmarked learnings that we can have from those markets that are more advanced at this sort of thing than we are? And how do we solve that conflict between infrastructure and volumes and vice versa? That's for you, MEC. You can unmute and engage us on that one.
No, very briefly, and thank you very much. ESCOM is affecting me this side where I am. No, let me just say to you that obviously scholars can help us on the chicken and egg argument. The classical argument is still not resolved. I think the jury is still out whether it's the chicken first or the egg. But in my approach, and the approach that I prefer, and this is based on the South African realities and what I consider to be buyer sentiment and what I've seen, because I also have people calling me, I bought an electric vehicle, I returned it because of these issues. So my approach and my advice, which doesn't mean it's correct, by the way, it's just my personal view, subject to correction, is that we must not look back at rolling out infrastructure. If I had my way, like I've said to you, we have commissioned a team led by Mr. Jack van der Merwe to help us. And we are saying, shouldn't we engage Gautrain Management Agency to seriously consider rolling out charging points at stations? And they will give me feedback soon about whether that is doable or not, and how are we going to do that in case they agree. And I'm going to make sure that they agree, because those are well-located spaces. And of course, we'll have to look into townships as well. But my point is this: infrastructure for electric vehicles is critical for buyer sentiment. So for me, I have an issue with us calling it, and I listened in this year, 2021 Transport Month at Global Mobility, Smart Mobility Summit. I listened to the experts and of course government officials who were making it chicken and egg, and I said we shouldn't. And I want to say we shouldn't have that argument. I think to the extent possible, we must roll out infrastructure. And I'll say that we're not doing what is called biting the bullet. It's not even biting the bullet. It is doing the right thing because it will influence buyer behavior, buyer sentiment. If you want me to abandon my car, the current one I have, you have got to put me in a comfort position that I'm not exposing myself to things I can't explain. You can imagine with high crime rates in South Africa, electricity can go away wherever you are, still charging. With all these problems, you want to put people in a comfort zone. So my conclusion is that I think the argument of chicken and egg is not helping us. There's no chicken and egg here. We need to install infrastructure as part of building the trust required by people to buy and to purchase electric vehicles. And as government, we must take the lead. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much on that one, MEC. Very, very helpful. Mr. Babasa, I think for me, NAMSA is one of the most important stakeholders in this view, and that is not to put you on a hot seat or a pedestal. I really think that your stakeholders are quite powerful in driving the future of where we want to go. And as NAMSA, you've consistently reiterated and demonstrated the need for progressive thinking around this. So for me, how do we better integrate and coordinate the efforts in this space? Because you've got different players implementing their own infrastructure. You've got a pricing challenge. You've got a policy and a duty a challenge where the duties are still quite high. You've got a lack of incentive for myself and yourself as consumers. If we were in another country, for example, we will get a tax break. We will get a substantial discount for going electric. How do we better coordinate and integrate efforts in this space between all the stakeholders?
Yeah, thank you very much, Thabang. I wanted to just agree with the MEC that we do not have a chicken and egg dilemma here. Because remember, the overwhelming majority of charging is actually going to happen from home charging.
True.
Because our daily commute requirements, in order for people to be able to commute from home to work and for them to be able to commute to economic centers and other economic activities around where they live, the majority of those charging requirements are going to be happening at home. And 90% of the time, those charging requirements will also be happening overnight, like we do, for example, when we charge our cell phones before we go to bed. The big question when we talk about charging infrastructure speaks to when people have to do long distance travel. For an example, from Musina to Cape Town, and to make sure that all those charging infrastructure facilities are available in order for people to be able to use on a regular basis. And also when you look at the current rollout of our current infrastructure, the concentration is not necessarily in residential areas. The concentration currently is also on the main arterial road, for example, our national roads, in order for us to be able to make sure and to guarantee people the opportunity to be able to can charge their vehicles on those particular charging stations. And it is for this reason that we are obviously engaging not only with the companies that are bringing these vehicles into the market, because up until now, the vehicles that we have in the market currently that are electric vehicles, pure electric vehicles, the infrastructure that we have in the market is infrastructure that was invested by these particular companies that are bringing vehicles into the South African market. We want to be able to now stimulate demand and obviously for other private sector investors to be able to invest in charging infrastructure. And we are already starting conversations, for an example, with the petroleum companies so that we can be able to see how we can be able to use the existing infrastructure that they have already rolled out across the country, because it is obviously going to become another challenge for us to create new white elephants where we are going to set up infrastructure for charging purposes outside, for an example, the petroleum industry facilities that we already have across the country. So we are already collaborating and working very closely with many of them. I mean, you've seen, for an example, a number of companies are also beginning to change their naming convention. I mean, Total, for an example, is Total Energies, because they are now, looking at new opportunities to be able to see how the future is unfolding, so that they can really be able to participate in this new evolution that we are all talking about. So absolutely. So it's going to be a coordinated effort in order for us to be able to make sure that we are able to inspire confidence. And the other issue that we also need to be able to resolve, particularly from a policy homologation and regulatory point of view, it's also conformity, because currently, and as some of these vehicles were coming into the market and charging infrastructure was introduced, you were not able to charge one vehicle on another charging infrastructure facility. And so on. So we need to be able to make sure that there is, the charging infrastructure is universal. Whether you are driving a BMW, you can be able to charge in a charging infrastructure that has been erected by another competitor, and so on. So those are some of the teething issues that we certainly need to be able to debate and discuss in order for us to really be able to make sure that South Africa is able to finalize some of its pressing challenges that we have as a country, to be able to make sure that adoption of electric vehicles is certainly embraced as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mabasa, for that good insight. Let me rope in my colleague Stefan here. One of the questions says private sector commitment to this. I think we see a lot of commitment from certain brands in supporting adoption. I guess as a bank, I think Nedbank being the green bank, we are pro environment. We've got a strong ECG directive and strategy, but can you just take us through some of this is a neutral question from here around what our appetite is and how are we challenging ourselves to create products that specifically will drive adoption in the EV space?
Yeah, thanks, Tabang. I mean, just first of all, I think Nedbank as a bank cannot drive the product. I mean, that's OEM's responsibility. But I think we've got a responsibility in terms of the financing CVP around that. And as I previously mentioned, for me, it's all about kind of not discriminating against the product. I think that is very critical. In fact, it's the opposite. We almost need to subsidize and support the product much more to actually agree with Nedbank's green vision and strategy. And then I think lastly, as the main vehicle financier in South Africa, we've got a large responsibility, to get our scorecards, our risk appetite, our pricing, our insurance offering, even all our value added products, for example, the tire and warranty, the maintenance plan, all of that. I think for us, it will be ideal to actually package it very nicely together and actually drive that real affordability agenda in the market.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I'm going to wrap up. I've been cautiously avoiding this one because the MEC was quite straightforward in mentioning it. There's a statistic that says that in order for us to go EV in South Africa, we would need about 12% extra electricity generation capacity in order to support the EV space. That's an interesting stat, and Mr. Mabasa mentioned, and I read a similar stat that said actually between 80 and 90% of charging in markets that have strong EV adoption is at home. So I guess it supports what MEC was saying, that infrastructure must be rolled out, but actually there is a stopgap because most charging happens at home anyways. So the question here, maybe Mr. Mlota can take this one for us, unfortunately, around the energy crisis really that we have in this country, and how that is a potential inhibitor of adoption and of growth of electric vehicles and electric mobility as a theme. I know it's a thorny one, however, I think it will be amiss of us not to take some time to ventilate that one. Mr. Mlota? Maybe the MEC will also weigh in there around, from a province perspective, how they are engaging that elephant in the room.
Thank you, Thabang. This is quite a difficult question, a tricky one at that. However, we've also realized that most benefit of operating electric vehicles in the country, that is in relation to the environment, would be realized when the source of the energy, the source of electricity is renewable energy. So with the current situation we're in, let alone the reliability of our electricity now, as we see there's a rolling load shedding, but the most benefit for the environment would be when we use renewables like solar energy. However, it comes at a cost. So in setting up or in considering the establishment of charging stations, it would be ideal to ensure that those stations draw in the energy from solar, for instance, so that there is a reliable supply, but also it's renewable energy. However, compared to the source being Eskom at this point, would find that a solar charging station would be 3 to 4 times more expensive. So there is a cost element. However, it is something that all the stakeholders, government and the private sector, would need to address carefully, which is why perhaps it might even be better, as the MEC indicated, that he's asked a team to look at setting up charging stations at the Gautrain stations, where such stations would draw their energy not from the grid, but from solar panels. It means a larger investment, but the overall impact would be better, and also those would mean that they are not as affected by load shedding or by the reliability of the current network at this stage. So it is something that we're looking at. However, as I indicated earlier, resource availability is quite key. But just one kind of statistic on the infrastructure, if I may. We've noticed that currently South Africa has a charging station for every 5 vehicles. And this is above the global standard of 8 vehicles per charging station. However, a key issue for South Africa is that the distribution of such charging stations is quite imperfect. They are more in the cities and across the major route that is from Johannesburg to Cape Town. So that is what needs to be addressed if we are to expand the reach and the accessibility of EVs for the consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. MEC, a last bite from you. We've just clocked at time. We're about to close, and I'll have some closing remarks there.
My 2 points. One is that we need more of these conversations. I want to plead with you that this must not be the last. I don't have to speak. I can be invited to come and learn. I've learned a lot. But which leads to my second point. But one, the issue here is, if you listen to the speakers, good knowledge, and even some of the issues have been raised and they've clarified me. But how much investments are we doing in educating Jacob Mamabulo in the street about because remember, perceptions, stereotype, some of the things are not factual. How do we empower people with information? How do we make it easy for people to understand? Do we have at various points people with pamphlets, with flyers? What is the level of investment in education, and who must do that to help the members of the public clarify the issues? You know, there are different types of these vehicles. Some are, we talk about plug-in hybrid, we talk about battery electric, we talk about hydrogen fuel cell. How do people understand all this? And then the real last issue for me on the financing, I take the challenge that financing should be spread amongst all of us through subsidies and making it easy to reduce the cost of doing business, because this is about climate change, it's about the future, and all of us must contribute to the cost issues. But I still want to say to the banks that for me, I thought the answer, and of course I like including the insurance industry. I thought I will hear something like, because we want to have a good uptake, we want to reach out to people. I thought that there will be an incentive, sort of a scheme, and understand me well, that should include benefits from potential lowering of costs by government itself. But I thought there will be an incentive scheme that says, if you are taking this route, this is how we'll make it easy for you. Reduction in interest rates. There could be some, easy for you. What is the incentive? I'm happy that there are not going to be onerous policies or, requirements. But where is the incentive to attract? How are we incentivizing the buyer in terms of, because the perception is that the cost is about the bank and money you can get motor vehicle financing. So I'm just saying to Nedbank, I think in the next conversations, I am pleading with you to research an incentive scheme to incentivize the market. And of course, we can look at how then different sectors make it possible to lower the costs, insurance schemes and all that. So, but otherwise, thanks for inviting me. Thank you very much. And let's move forward to electric vehicles. It is the best way forward. We don't seem to be having any better alternative. We must do our part to embed in all of us the need to transit to electric vehicles. But well done to Nedbank, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, MEC. I'm expecting that you'll connect us to Mr. van der Merwe. I think between Stefan and I, we are keen to talk to him about the fleet solutions you were talking about. Thank you also for, which is very interesting for us to, the MEC seems to have a very customer first kind of mindset, which is more what you see in the private sector, which for me, that's really the level that we need to be thinking about in terms of practicality. Let me take the opportunity to just thank our other participants as well. Mr. Mlota, very, very good insights from your side. I think still a lot of work to be done in terms of the policy side of things and the strategies and the green papers and the white papers that are in action, but you've demonstrated to us that that work is indeed happening. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciated. Mr. Mabasa, as I said, again, I put the challenge to you. We as Nedbank would like for opportunities to partner with a partner such as yourself as NAMSTA at an industry level and find creative ways to increase awareness to increase uptake, to support the industry in as much as we can, given that yourselves being at the center liaise with all of us separately in different meetings. So I will definitely be taking you up, because this is something that we need to accelerate. But I thank you for your time today. It was over 2 hours, which is quite generous on all of you to join us, and the discussions were quite insightful. The questions were many. I was trying to filter them and put them through to all that stayed till the end. We thank you for that. Mr. Theo Malele, thank you very much for just putting the nuance from a mass public transport perspective. Very insightful, and also you've also proposed some solutions in the space, which is really where the magic is, right, in the solutions. And of course, my colleague Stefan Potgieter from Nedbank, and on the MFC side of things, I appreciate your insights as well, and some of the answers that you've given. To everyone that's online, I think I've done my best to not to be a presenter today. All of us have had to learn the skill with the onset of the COVID environment. However, I think we're still able to do business, we're still able to have engagements, and we're still able to have the public have a bird's eye view in some of the pertinent discussions that would otherwise be in closed rooms. Thank you very much for joining us for the Nedbank Energy Dialogue webcast for 2021. And till the next one, I'd like to say goodbye to all the participants. Thank you very much.